Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with all of you. Thank you for joining us today at the Devex Impact House. I know it's been a full day of programming. We've heard lots of topics, but I assure you the one we're about to get into now you haven't heard yet. In fact, I think it's a relatively new and exciting area of focus, certainly for me and maybe for many of you. So I'm excited to bring it to you today. In partnership with the Open Society Foundations and with Transparency International, we're really thrilled to be working together to bring this to you. Our conversation today makes me think of a famous Ernest Hemingway quote from The Sun Also Rises, where one character asks another, "Hey, how did you go bankrupt?" And the other character says, "Gradually, and then all at once." And I think many of us can relate to that. And in fact, sadly, some countries can relate to that. We've had a few examples of countries that have all at once gone bankrupt, seemingly, and a lot of others that might be in that gradual phase right now. And we're here to talk about an innovation, not in technology or in finance, as we've talked about on the stage so much today, but an innovation in advocacy. How do you actually change the trajectory of countries that might be in this situation where things are not going right when it comes to corruption or governance? And how do you do it using a tool that hasn't necessarily been on everyone's radar, a relatively new tool, which is from the IMF. There are these governance diagnostics that they do. And so maybe I can start with you, Joel, to tell us a little bit more about what are these governance diagnostics. Joel Turkowitz is the Deputy Unit Chief in the IMF Legal Department. This is the work you do every day. You've done it in a number of countries that the quote I just read sort of addresses. What are these diagnostics? Why are they relevant?
Sure, thanks, and thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for being here. So governance diagnostics are a tool that the IMF created after 2018, basically to operationalize. There's a new framework that was established by the IMF in 2018 on governance that was really trying to emphasize, trying to understand where corruption issues were impeding economic reform and stability, and to try and have a more dynamic approach to addressing corruption issues. So governance diagnostics are briefly they're reports that are done at the request of government, so the governments request them. They look at a number of features. They look at the extent to which corruption is a severe issue in a country and what the nature of corruption is. And then they look at the impact of corruption on core state functions. Core state functions that relate to things that the IMF's mandate relates to. So things like fiscal governance or central bank governance or financial sector oversight. And they come up with a set of recommendations of things that could be done. There's a multi-departmental team that does this. It is done with the cooperation and collaboration with governments, but also very much the idea is to go to countries and have relatively extended discussions with a whole variety of different stakeholders, government, but as well as private sector, civil society, a range, basically think tanks, a range of actors, both to understand their perspective and also to appreciate and information and different approaches. The one thing I just would like to emphasize is the theory behind a governance diagnostic is that economic reform is done most effectively when it is also combined with reforms relating to accountability and integrity. And that by combining those in a unified approach, you have greater salience and probability of success of on your economic governance reforms as well as on your accountability and integrity reform.
And this is a relatively new idea, Sami Moati, who's the head of emerging markets at T. Rowe Price, that the IMF is increasingly focusing on these other, non-economic factors, let's say. They're looking at anti-corruption, they're looking at governance. Presumably, this matters a lot to investors who might put capital at risk to buy debt from a country. How do investors see this evolving landscape and these governance diagnostics?
Sure. First, thanks for including me. I'm very happy to be here. I've been a long-time consumer of the content at Devex, so I feel like I need to give something back for all the free IP that I get from you.
Thank you.
So thanks for inviting me. So we manage a $32 billion emerging market debt business at T. Rowe Price with clients from Alaska to Australia. So basically taking largely retirement savings, 70% of it is retirement savings, long-term in nature, and matching that with the development needs of low-income countries around the world. That's the business that we're in. More than any, if I'm 20 years in the business, if I've learned anything, people spend too much time on fiscal deficits. They matter. What equally matters that doesn't get enough attention is a deficit of trust. I trust my 9-year-old daughter with a permanent marker more than I trust some of the people that I come across in this industry. It's a real challenge. And I say trust from the bondholder side, trust from the official sector side, and not disclosing what comparability of treatment means. And then, of course, we're turning to the countries now and trust in terms of governance of debt transparency. And so I think what we take a lot of excitement about on this effort in the governance diagnostic is it is a catalyst to repair that broken trust. The bondholder community cut off Sri Lanka from lending in 2019. That was 3 years before the default. And the governance diagnostic was assigned to us that this is a serious moment to potentially turn around, right? We still have to do our own work. And it'd be great to bring in Nishan here, because in that ultimate debt restructuring, what we had was a joint venture built on the momentum that started with the governance diagnostic, a joint venture between civil society and the private sector. Yes, those actually do happen. In designing the first ever governance-linked bond, which came out of Sri Lanka. So kind of turning a weakness into what I think could be a marker for strength.
Let's bring Nishan in exactly on that point. Nishan Demel is the executive director of Verité Research. You're the leading think tank in the country of Sri Lanka, and you play this key role exactly as Sammy described. So why do these governance diagnostics matter, or how did they matter in the case of Sri Lanka? What can we all learn from the opportunity of what you experienced there?
I think I want to build on what Joel said, that these governance diagnostics are sort of new instrument that IMF has put into place to better reflect the importance of governance and anti-corruption in economic recovery. We have argued, and did in Sri Lanka's case, that actually governance is foundational. To try to recover your economy without fixing governance is to build a house upon the sand. And Sri Lanka built it 16 times in the last 60 years, being in IMF programs for 30 years over the last 60 years. And we argued you cannot rinse and repeat and do the same thing. In fact, I think that the IMF may need to think that governance is always macrocritical, not only in special circumstances where they have to investigate and say, so we should get that into the baseline. And Joel's division needs to have more front and center involvement in almost every IMF program, with few exceptions, rather than the other way around.
So instead of this being kind of a supplement that's added on the side, it should be core in the way that IMF assesses
one should have
countries.
to not explain why a governance diagnostic is needed, but explain why it's not needed. Because in most countries that get into trouble, governance is at the core. There are three kinds of problems in getting governance actions in a program, even when we know they're important. One is the process that, there's a long process, right? You do the diagnostic, that happens 1 year after the program. Then you've got to get the diagnostic actions into the program. Then you've got to get them implemented by the government, who can delay implementation. So this is still not good enough, and we need to work better to program better. But I'll end by saying there's a conceptual problem here that civil society is trying to solve, and this is why the governance diagnostic that Kenya did, Sri Lanka did, matters so much. For the IMF, its partner is the government, because the government, elected government, is the democratic representatives of the people. However, if you understand democracy better, civil society and media is fundamental to the process of government. Elected leaders not automatically expected to do the right thing. And in countries where governance is bad, there's a particular problem with elected leaders not reflecting the interests of people properly. So the IMF is kind of trapped by saying the government is our partner and civil society is kind of an add-on on the side. that we kind of listen to, get information from, and then get trapped by the reticence and problems of government. So the very problem you're trying to solve trumps you trying to solve the problem. And I think we need to therefore have a conceptual way of also reinforcing the priority that IMF gives civil society. And I'll tell you later why the diagnostic became a kind of technology to solve the problem. But you understand the problem, right? Yeah.
And I think actually Sheila Masinde, who leads Transparency International in Kenya, you had an answer to exactly Nishan's point, which is you said, let's develop our own governance diagnostic, kind of a shadow governance diagnostic. Tell us that story. What prompted you to create it, and then what impact has it had?
Raj, I'm going to interrupt you to say this, that it's not a shadow diagnostic. It's a parallel diagnostic.
Okay.
That is not the real thing, and this is not the shadow. Okay, so we want to be very clear.
You want to make it clear. This is just as important.
No, I'm only saying it because actually it's not you. Lots of other people try to think that, oh, the IMF diagnostic is the real thing. So Sri Lanka, of course, did it too. And please, Sheila, yes, thank you. I just wanted to make
It's not just a parallel diagnostic. Let me just add an upper element to it. It's a people's diagnostic. And that's what we set out to do as a coalition of civil society actors working on public finance, and particularly looking at the debt situation that was really becoming not becoming, but had already become a really deep crisis of both financial and governance in nature. And why we called it the people's diagnostic is because we looked at the problem from the citizens' point of view, because these were issues that are affecting the citizens. And that is why we as a coalition, the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, which in English means, loosely translated, means save the economy, recover, rescue the economy, is that we felt that if we only let the IMF government process continue, the diagnostic process by IMF continue, without our strong input through a people's diagnostic, then maybe we might not really get the true picture of what's happening, and it's the citizens who really understand the problem. Because it's not just about the numbers in Excel sheets or books or reports, it's also what they're experiencing, their lived realities, and we needed to capture that. And to just show that governance is something that is affecting, bread and butter discussions on the tables of many Kenyans, and that is why we felt it was important. And also the fear that we might not have the opportunity to participate or be included in the process to the extent to which we needed to be included as civil society, as citizens and other stakeholders. Of course, when the diagnostic process finally happened, because this just happened over the last few months, but because we also made a strong statement that we're going to conduct and publish our own diagnostic, and this is actually what we came out to do. And I know that most of you have already received this booklet. It's just a summary of what we have found so far, because it's an ongoing process which we hope to conclude in the course of the month. And I'm going to hand this over to Joel, because as we wait for theirs, and hoping that we hope that this will also they will look at the results, the findings that we have, and the recommendations to consider them in the IMF-led diagnostic, because we felt it was important to do ours so that we can also influence, particularly the recommendations, because we felt if we don't participate, we may actually have very adulterated, recommendations based on just the engagements with government and not capturing the citizens' voices.
I love that innovation and advocacy, as I put it. And I guess, Sammy, how do investors see it? I mean, as an investor, is this a positive for you that there's another set of people's or parallel recommendations or diagnostics? How do you see this from an investor perspective?
So ultimately, any macroeconomic adjustment is largely going to require a primary balance adjustment. So ultimately, that's a bargain between a state and society. So if society is not bought into the adjustment will not work, and that's not good for investors. So very much welcome the diversity and the collaboration on these important issues.
Can I just, so I think this is a really essential evolution, I guess I would say, of the interaction. And I would actually very strongly agree that this is not a parallel diagnostic. I think we've always been very clear the way the IMF defines governance relates to our mandate. And I think it is fundamental to appreciate that sometimes the issues about corruption are not the ones that are most visible, but the ones that are most insidious and least visible. So people don't understand how the central banks work and how central banks, operate in ways that when they have been corrupted, really fundamentally affect people's well-being and societal well-being. Those sorts of, but I think it's critical to appreciate that neither is, diagnostics exist as a way of pointing to directions and enable certain types of discussions to happen within the fund. And allow for certain types of commitments to be made that the fund can then also be actively involved in. But I do believe that they are relatively unimportant unless they're also supported by much broader dimensions and much broader aspects. We know a lot about governance, which is that basically any time, especially in places with high levels of corruption, anytime you make progress, what you should assume is there's going to be then an effort to roll back that progress by all of the elites who've had their rents taken away. So it's not, and the fund is never, the fund is an important institution, but the fund is never going to be able to actually create accountability in a sustained fashion or the relationships between government and its citizens. And so that, I think, is a critical dimension. The only thing I would just add is, I think in Sri Lanka, and my sense in Kenya as well, it's also happened in Pakistan, that it is not that the recommendations of civil society are radical, and there are places of overlap and places where there's not overlap. When there are places of overlap, I think we often have very common understandings of what needs to be done. So there are degrees of commonality as well as degrees of differences, which I think are really important.
Nishan, give us the kind of the broad global perspective, because you had an interesting point about the reality the IMF faces. They're constrained by their concept of what is government, their counterpart relationship with a democracy. This debt question is global. I mean, it's hard. It's easier to find the countries that are not affected than the ones that are, right? How do you take the lessons of what you've accomplished here in Sri Lanka, what's happening in Kenya? Is this broadly applicable? And what is the mechanism through which it actually is working to generate results?
So I want to be careful to say that when I say, the IMF doesn't understand it, the IMF also, in this case, we can divide into two sections, right? There's the economists who run the program, and then there's this governance and anti-corruption division who sits on the side, and that's also parallel. And I'm arguing that within the IMF, we must put governance and anti-corruption far more into the center of programming. And this is an evolution that the IMF needs, difficult to get, but without getting there, we won't get far enough. Secondly, I want to say that while I'm arguing so Sri Lanka did a civil society governance diagnostic published just before the IMF one. I really appreciate the governance diagnostic the IMF did as well. And, there's certainly, as Joel says, technical abilities that they brought in that really enhanced what we could do on governance and anti-corruption. So this is not a one-upmanship or this is complementary. There's great complementarity in both the civil society and the IMF doing a governance diagnostic. And I don't want to devalue what we got from Joel's division for Sri Lanka, right? But I think the recognition of a partnership and a complementarity and collaborative approach here can be really useful in advancing and putting front and center the need to build a foundation on which economic problems can be successfully resolved. And I think in Sri Lanka, society began commending the IMF for the first time. I mean, it's normally, as usual, in developing countries, an imperial, institution trying to impose itself on poor countries, which in some ways, of course, there are reasons to argue that. But when the IMF started talking governance and anti-corruption, you got public support.
Yeah.
So this is good all round.
In a moment, I want to see if we can squeeze in one or two questions or comments from the folks in the audience. There's a microphone there. You can go ahead and make your way if you would like to say something. Sammy, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a brief intervention. not only is this possible, it is absolutely necessary. Don't take for granted that there's money available to finance these countries. Sovereign debt resides in it. For everyone on this stage and in this room and listening online, you probably think about finance as a way for a country to bridge its present to its future. The investors largely don't think about it that way, right? It's a bond, it has a coupon, and that category of income is a fiercely competitive category. And there are many, many other options for investors to own besides emerging market sovereign debt that have an attractive yield to drama ratio. So if we don't get our house in order on this issue, emerging market, the amount of assets dedicated to that space has gone down considerably post-COVID at the same time that financing needs have gone up.
Do you think this is related to what people often say is the perceived risk premium of sovereign debt from developing countries? Like, is it this governance and anti-corruption problem?
So you see it currently embedded in a higher interest expense. So some of the countries that have come to market, Kenya, Angola, borrowing near 10% interest rates. I'm worried about 2 or 3 years from now when the money is just not available, right? So if we don't get our house in order on this transparency issue, the category becomes less competitive, less people invest in it, and then, if we don't have market access, we have bigger issues.
Sheila, in a moment, we're going to have a Kenyan member of parliament on stage and a high court advocate. And I want to understand from you, what's the mechanism of action? We saw you hand this over to Joel, which is quite interesting to see. What do you expect to happen from here in terms of the actual political debate, the civil society rising up in the country? How does it work?
I think for us, one of the things that we've been gunning for, and that's why we set out to do the People's Diagnostic, is that the diagnostic report must be made public. We're not waiting for the conclusion of the report to say that, but that is one of the minimum demands of this process, so that Kenyans can know the outcome. Because all along, and that's where I agree with Dr. Nishan's comment about how do you base or ensure that governance and anti-corruption considerations are embedded across all the actions of the IMF, is because for us, one of the frustrations was that despite the different programs that Kenya was entering into with the IMF, that there was so much blinding or lack of consideration that even as these programs are continuing, and yet there have been obligations made on addressing and corruption, misuse of resources, and so on, particularly in terms of how we're managing debt. And this got into as conditionalities into the programs, but nothing was being done. It was more of a tick the box exercise. So you said that you're going to build get a conflict of interest law. Okay, yes, it's done. But then there's no effort to ensure that, okay, but is it actually being implemented? And those are the concerns that we had, that yes, enter these programs, but ensure as IMF that as you're signing these programs with the government, are they meeting the conditions that have been made, particularly those touching on governance and corruption? Because if we're not ensuring these conditions have been met, then we're not really building a process through which we're able to ring fence and protect those very resources. And that's why I agree that we have to ensure that we work on governance and anti-corruption in these programs. But as I said, for us right now, we are pushing that this report must be made.
Who decides? Is that the IMF's decision?
That's a government
or a government
decide.
decision. Okay.
But I think one of the things that we've challenged the IMF is some of these rules and processes must change. And we just must ensure that this reports, because they're not being done for the government, they're being done for the people in these countries. They're going to affect the people. Those lack of corruption, lack of reforms is affecting the people. So we don't want these processes to be done, and they're long and tedious. I mean, the Kenyan one has taken 8 months or so far or more, because we started talking about it last year, so it's more than a year now. I think the report is going to be out sometime, maybe, I don't know, end of the year or maybe next year. But then what's the point if it's just going to sit in a government office? It needs to be out there so that we are also able as citizens, civil society, to monitor the implementation of the reforms that have been proposed.
We've got time maybe for one quick comment or question. Just tell us your name and organization, if you would, and let us know what you think.
Sure. My name is Toby McIntosh. I'm with ION Global Transparency. There have been about 15 of these reports published, and there are about 5 in process. Transparency International has recommended they be mandatory and there be a much more defined process for citizen engagement. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, Nishan, you want to say a word about that?
And we should then go to Joel. So yes, we did kind of hold Joel's feet to the fire, right? So we came, and to do that, we had to, of course, why does Joel talk to anyone at all? There are hundreds of civil society organizations. We created a coalition of the 5 most powerful, gave ourselves leverage, and came and asked him, well, how is the IMF accountable to us? Right? And then we said, well, we gave him some offers. We said, for instance, will you transcribe everything we say and publish it? So that we don't just speak words that you cherry pick and decide what to take on and what to leave out. And this is a huge frustration. Kenyans stopped working with the IMF for a while on that basis and said, we won't even meet you. Now, so this was a negotiation in which it wasn't personal. It was trying to bring pressure on the institution to behave better, and the institution couldn't behave better. But we continued the personal engagement and said, oh, we'll do our own civil society diagnostic, right? So that's how it began. Yes, the IMF can change policies to create much greater ability to formalize that relationship and at least create much more power or leverage for what civil society says to enter into its diagnostic. I'll stop there to let Joel say anything else. Yeah.
Give us a window, if you could, into what is this debate like inside the IMF?
So thanks. I mean, actually, I should say one of my first jobs was with the Open Society. I actually have a civil society background.
So you've got some sympathy to these ideas, I think.
What do I want to say here? What I would say is, I think it is critical for institutions like the IMF to be doing work like diagnostics. I think it was a very important step that happened in 2000. The IMF has had an anti-corruption policy since 1997. It just had never really been fully implemented until 2018. And then in 2018, there was a change and the diagnostics were created and have evolved since that time. And if you look at a diagnostic that happened in 2019, it doesn't look so much like a diagnostic that happens now in 2024. So there's a continuing evolution, just as I think there's a continuing evolution about what the interaction with civil society is. And I think this sort of the idea of these ways of using diagnostics as platforms for engagement, not just platforms for engagement from the IMF, but platforms for engagement between the IMF and civil society and broadly on these issues, I think is really important. And I think also with bondholders. I think these are really, when thinking about points of entry, one of the things we have to appreciate is that, I mean, frankly, the work on governance and anti-corruption has not been a raging success over the last 30 years, right? This is, it's not that it hasn't accomplished things, but it hasn't accomplished the achievements that we would hope for and have wanted. So I think all of these things are parts of evolution. So do I think that diagnostics will become required? No, and I actually don't think that it would be particularly useful for them to be required. My experience with diagnostics has been, unless you build trust with governments and with others, they become just relatively pointless exercises. I would also say we have no examples where the government was not part of the effort to address corruption that succeeded. We don't have an example where actually in opposition to the government, an anti-corruption approach was implemented. Those don't exist. So the reality is there have to be find ways of working where governments are also seeing that there is value and there are benefits to be had through addressing some of these issues, and that there are demands and urgency for change that are voiced by the private sector, by civil society, and by institutions like the IMF.
Well, I guess you could argue that the pressure you create on the government through civil society being able to argue for this helps to change the government's own opinion on
I
this
want to
issue.
come in because this is one where I don't agree with Joel, right? We had this conversation yesterday also, I think. Simply that Joel underestimates the power that IMF has over actions of government when it wants to have that power. Cost-reflective pricing of utilities. You think government gets to decide? Hell no. and there are, balancing the budget or cutting the deficit. Does government get to decide? Hell no. Why is it true that anti-corruption activities never succeed from the IMF without government cooperating? Because the IMF staff don't care too much. They don't make them structural benchmarks. In Sri Lanka, sorry, Joel, I'm disagreeing with you. In Sri Lanka, they made it a condition to publish the governance diagnostic and made it a structural benchmark. Did the government publish it voluntarily? Hell no. They had no choice. Now, do I like the fact that an organization like the IMF can dictate to my government and get them to do stuff? I don't. But if it's on governance and anti-corruption, I'll accept it because that's my reality, right? I will use them. And that's why I want to have a say-so on what that governance diagnostic is. And I want to use it to get my government that's misbehaving to behave better. I don't like it. This is something wrong with the world, but it's also something wrong with our own countries, where we can't get governments representing our interests by just being our civil society. And we need this kind of threat of IMF withholding funding to get that done. So Joel underestimates the power that IMF has, but we have a problem that the staff that's doing the programming undervalue governance action. So they don't put it as structural benchmarks or qualitative indicators, they put it under other indicators. Of course, government knows I can just ignore the other indicators and there's no consequence. It doesn't get triggered in the board. So that's an IMF problem, not an inability. I'll stop there.
I don't know if you know this, Joel, but you're on the stage where the television program Crossfire used to be held. So let me give you a chance to just respond to Nishan.
So sure, and I think Sheila might want to. So I think there are strong responsibilities that the IMF has. I think it's critical for the IMF to appreciate actually its authority and power. That we do have the ability to have consequence, especially oftentimes when we are working with governments who are in particular need of our assistance. So I don't underestimate that. What I'm also appreciative of is, as Nishan has said, the IMF has had 16 programs in Sri Lanka, half of them that have ended before they were finalized. Kenya, I believe, has about the same. Pakistan has 22. I mean, frankly, so I think that's an indication that yes, the IMF, has a degree of authority, and when they when part of the conditionality in a loan is you hit that number for what you're allowed to have as your debt number for a limited period of time, that number will be hit. Will it actually enable you to make sustained change, especially around these relationships between the government and people, and actually what people expect of their government and what the government delivers? No, I think there's, and it's not, I would just emphasize, it's not that there's no example of the IMF supporting, there's no example when you look at governance and anti-corruption work worldwide. We don't have any example of a situation where the government and the governance and anti-corruption work was done in opposition to the government. Governments need to buy in, and that's the truth. So it may be, and it is critical to make sure that you are making an argument that allows government to do positive things and get rewarded for doing positive things.
We're going to take 1 or 2 extra minutes. We're going to end with you, Sheila, but I want to come to you, Sammy, on this because we're talking a lot, Nishan and Joel, in this debate, because they agree on one thing, which is that the money that the IMF brings to the table has a lot of power, right? The private sector has a lot of money to bring to the table too. Sure. What is the private sector voice here? Is there a chance that in the examples where there have been governance diagnostics, that countries can look at this and say, you know what, there's evidence, we will save money, we will be able to borrow at a lower rate if we pursue these approaches?
So I can solve this. So I'm going to quote Hamilton, the guy who lost the duel, not the Broadway play. Power without revenue in political society is just a name. I know that firsthand. I also had a job prior to managing money. I worked as a civil servant. I worked in the municipality of Bethlehem, where my family's from, and my job was to collect taxes. I will say that again. I was a tax collector in Bethlehem.
Sammy, I wanted to invite you for dinner to my place today.
Well, 12 years of Catholic schooling taught me that I'm on the wrong side of biblical history. But I did learn something important. If you increase the tax base, there's plenty of money in developing countries, it's just not in the borders. If you increase the tax base, you increase the velocity of money, you increase domestic capital markets formation, and then you don't need money from me or the IMF.
Sheila, we're going to move to a discussion about Kenya. Some of your country people are going to be on stage in a moment. Where do we go from here? Because in Kenya, it's a live thing. It's not just a debate. It's not theoretical. This is happening now. Where do we take this? What can the audience take away from what's going on in Kenya today and where this debate is going to move in real life?
Exactly what I like the debate between Nishan and Joel, because for us, we saw citizens demanding, knowing that IMF was a problem, demanding IMF accountability. So while Joel is undermining or undervaluing the whole, power of the IMF, in Kenya, the people believe that IMF was a critical problem in terms of taking us to where we got in terms of the economy and also the governance crisis.
They were part of the problem.
I mean, I remember 2 or 3 years ago where Kenyans actually stormed an online meeting of the IMF, because they were so angry when we had the anti-finance bill protests and the Gen Z-led protests last year. One of the high critical calls was that we needed to get the IMF in order because they felt that they were dragging us into that deep dark hole where we had sunk. Because they were facilitating, the government by turning a blind eye to the fact that despite all these programs that we were entering into, government was not meeting some of those governance benchmarks that had been made and just saying, waving on, move on, let's move on to the next, and forgetting that we haven't fixed certain critical pillars in terms of our governance and fiscal oversight, infrastructure. And when citizens, ordinary citizens in the village, women out there in the market, everyone knows that IMF has a problem and is part of what has led us to this, that tells you, the fact that we need to fix our IFIs, because I know there's the IMF, there's a World Bank, because I know today we're talking about the IMF, but people felt that there was a critical change that we needed to see in terms of how IMF conducts its business. And I think we really need to look and really take this seriously. What reforms are needed? I mean, Joel is a good guy, as we said. He runs a department which we believe is an ally, but then there are others who may not see it that way, and that's why the governance discussion needs to be really centered as countries continue to engage with the IMF. But I think also as we move forward is also to see increasingly how this kind of discussions on debt are really transparent, they're inclusive in terms of people participating, because when countries borrow money, it's citizens that are paying for it. And right now it is so sad that a child born in Kenya, by the time you're born, if I gave birth to a baby right now, even before that baby can even learn how to be able to grasp a shilling, they're already owing millions of shillings, Exactly, So that's why we really need to fix this problem, involve citizens, be transparent, let there be access to information, and that's why we are pushing for this kind of things, both from our government and also from the IMF.
Thank you so much. I think we've seen the power of a truly public and open debate today. So a big thank you to this fantastic panel for a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. And as they exit the stage, we will be joined by two new panelists to continue this discussion. Thank you so much. Let me ask our colleagues who are with us, Diana Gichengo, the advocate of the High Court of Kenya, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and with TISA to join us on stage, and the Honorable Zachary Kwenya Thuku, who's a member of the Kenyan Parliament. There's microphones next to you. You can grab one. You heard that spirited debate that we just had. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Kenya case because it is live. It is happening right now. Maybe we can start with you, Diana, to just talk to us about how this is working on the ground in Kenya right now. Is there a framework for this? You know, you're a lawyer. Like, how does this work from a legal perspective in Kenya?
Thank you very much, Raj. And like Sheila has indicated, in Kenya, what we've done is we have linked all our fiscal processes with constitutionalism. So debt is future tax. It will be paid by the taxpayers. IMF negotiates with government. There's no place for citizen. Luckily for us, we had told the IMF when they didn't listen, we opened digital notice boards and we put out all our notices there. But immediately the IMF announced that there will be a governance diagnostic. We told them we will write our people's diagnostic. Based on, in our constitution, there's an article we call Article 1, which says we the people are sovereigns. So as sovereigns, we are paying tax, and because of that, we've created an alternative process. That process, we do not see it as a process that will be finalized in DC. It will be finalized in our National Assembly. Because ultimately, the fixes that we need in our economy are governance problems, whether it's budgeting, it's our treasury and our National Assembly. So we've created alternative processes for direct engagement with the IMF, with our elected representatives, and in the interim, the reforms that are going on, whether they are linked to prior actions of the World Bank or the IMF, where they do not sit right with us, we go to court. And I think every week lately, we are stopping things we are not comfortable with.
So you are finding a legal approach and you're really formalizing this advocacy. This is not just people in the streets who are angry. This is saying we can use the Kenyan Constitution to find a way forward. Zachary, as a member of parliament, how does this look to you? Because I assume your constituents talk to you a lot about debt. This is a very prominent issue in the country. Do they also, as we heard in the last panel, do they also think about the IMF's role in this? And how do you see the opportunity here to leverage the IMF to make the kind of changes you want when it comes to Kenya's debt situation?
Thank you for having me around, and good evening, everyone. Well, we have had a long journey with IMF, and especially from 90s to from 1980, 90, and the millennium, on the issue of reforms, governance reforms, and financial hygiene. And certainly, we have had issues with the publics, because the entry point of IMF is through the executive. And that being the entry, citizens are not involved. And therefore, the many proposals that they come up with in terms of the reforms that they want implemented so that they can continue funding our fiscal gaps, and especially issues to do with liquidity, they are rushed by the executive so that then they benefit within that fiscal year. And it has become a big challenge because some of the proposals, especially in terms of fiscal reforms, they are proposals whereby taxes are supposed to be increased. And that being the case, it has given birth to social unrest, a lot of litigations, and I mean, from all quarters, from civil society.
People in the streets.
Yeah, people resist because you get into their past. And of course now parliament, because most of the times the majority of the members of parliament come from the government side. It is so easy to bring about the reforms that are proposed by IMF and World Bank. And therefore, civil society is becoming in handy to amplify citizens' voice so that then they are heard. And maybe if they're not heard through parliament, because as she has stated, we have in our constitution, Article 1 says that the sovereignty of our country is within, I mean, it's in the hearts of the people are sovereign. And if their representatives do not voice their will, then they can exercise their mandate as citizens of the republic.
This is a very controversial topic in Kenya, right? You lead an organization, the Institute for Social Accountability, TISA. What are the implications for your organization and for other civil society organizations? Give us a sense of the push and pull right now. Are people taking you to court too? I mean, what are the regulatory or legal risks that you face?
Thanks. In Kenya, definitely organizations that are working on economic justice, fiscal governance. Previously, it was the organizations that work on democracy, human rights that would be attacked. But right now, organizations that work on anti-corruption, we are really scrutinized. So first and foremost, we have a new regulatory authority that was supposed to allow civil society to self-regulate. But instead, what we see is a lot of executive overreach, the need to keep reporting. And particularly last year when we had the unrest, I head the Institute for Social Accountability, but I convene a coalition of over 40 organizations that work on different aspects of the economy and governance. Within those 40, the government decided to indicate that we were the ones supporting 16 of them. Out of the 16 that were listed as being linked, I think, to Ford Foundation, 7 are members of Okoa Uchumi. And what we produce is knowledge. We analyze. We tell stories that people can connect with. So that is one of the areas. Then secondly, there is the control of how we do our convenings. That has also shrunk significantly. Just yesterday, I don't know, the leader, the people's president died yesterday in Kenya. And as the people's president died, the president, the people's president is known as Raila Odinga. He's been the leader of opposition. The president assented to 6 pieces of legislation. 8, sorry. Of those, 1 takes away the power of parliament when it comes to privatization. Something that is very much encouraged by IMF and so on. So part of the debate, but the power to decide how public asset will become privatized, we have willed away the role of parliament. Then we express ourselves through digital tools. There was a discussion on digital public infrastructure. Now they've criminalized certain acts of expression. And the biggest problem we have right now, where our tensions lie, Honorable Kwenya listens, but we have tensions with Parliament because our Parliament is captured by the executive. They no longer represent us. So we have created a people's parliament on social media, in the streets, and so on. And then our space to hold the line has now been criminalized through the legislation that was assented to yesterday. Those are only 2. The others, we are still reading them, but it's just mischievous. That is the space we are operating in, a space where we have to fill in the gap of constitutional institutions. Our Auditor General is permanently being attacked by institutions based on the reports that the office is producing, because there are very many adverse findings, very, very many. When the executive attacks her, sometimes Parliament, who ought to be the board members of Kenya, if the board is not happy with the findings of an audit, then we go back to the shareholders, who are the people. So again, on that particular front, there have been tension. That's the space we are operating in. But Raj, we are not victims. In Kenya, we are not victims. We are holding the line. We are holding the line very well.
Zachary, what about you? Are you holding the line in Parliament? It sounds like, as we heard, some of your ability to influence this agenda is being reduced based on what we just heard. What is your perspective on it?
Raj, it's easier to say that Parliament has been captured by the executive, but you must appreciate the processes that we go through in terms of legislation, especially on the matter that she's just raised. I want to make some correction that indeed I am the one who moved an amendment to include Parliament in the processes of the sale of public assets. And therefore, maybe what she read was what was proposed. But what was passed by the National Assembly is completely different from what was proposed, because we have a whole process of legislation. Anything can be proposed, but what comes out and what is assented to are two different things.
So you're saying Parliament retains the right to decide what gets privatized and what doesn't?
Indeed, yes. That schedule has to be brought to the National Assembly for the National Assembly to give its nod, and then the process goes on. As to a point whereby now an asset has been offloaded from, the government, the public interest is less than 50%. If the government decides again to sell its stake, that matter has to be brought to the National Assembly for assent. Then the process can continue. So really, I don't want to believe that Parliament has been held captive by the National Assembly, but at times you appreciate, as I said, that most of the MPs are aligned to the government side, and therefore the government is able to pull through its agenda without much pressure, because there's always this process of whipping members from the ruling party to act in a certain way. But finally, on the issue of debt, is because you brought it up, and I think that is where our oversight is coming in, and the issue of IMF. We are already at 67% debt to GDP, and of course, which is a very risky area. But we're coming down because we have passed a law in the National Assembly that our debt anchor should not be anything beyond 55%. But we've given ourselves time, because it's not something that can be achieved overnight. By the year 2027, we are trying to see how much we can pull back, so that then we are just 55 plus 5 and not beyond. So at most 60%. Then the issue of public participation in terms of what the government or executive signs. Now that is where the civil society is coming in to push, just to make sure that IMF does not advance loans at will, at the behest of the executive. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and that is budgeting cycle. Make sure that the estimates that are presented in the National Assembly are realistic, and we're also involving public in the same when we're doing budget estimates. And finally, on the fiscal deficit, because our budgets are never balanced. Our expenses are higher than the revenue that we collect. Therefore, that gap is now where Bretton Woods organizations comes in, institutions come in to finance the gap.
Will the Parliament have a voice on whether or not the IMF governance diagnostics get released to the public?
Well, it's a conversation that we're having, because we're trying to see how we can loop in a legislation that is going to cause executive to come to Parliament prior to any borrowing. As it is today, they can only report that you give us there's something that we call medium-term debt strategy, where we give them an open check that this is the amount that we're going to borrow, and therefore we allow them. Once they borrow, that is when they come back after every quarter. Reports where they report the National Assembly, this is the much that we've borrowed. And if there are areas where they flaunted the law, because the law, the resolutions of Parliament, maybe they're assumingly that they had given us a borrowing mix of maybe 55 to 45. 55 is what we're going to get from our partners, and 45 we're going to get domestically or from domestic market. Then they have to report. But now you see, now Parliament there will be acting like Morticians. The money has already been spent, has been borrowed. So there's nothing much we can do. Because once that report, what else can you do? You cannot reverse. That is why we are trying to see if we can loop a legislation that is going to cause executive to come to parliament before, because parliament is
Get
the
this report released publicly before a decision is made on the debt. We're running out of time. I'm going to give you the last word, Diana. What kinds of safeguards or reforms can be put in place to ensure this dynamic that you and other civil society leaders are taking forward can continue in Kenya? I mean, you say there's a lot of pushback. So what do you want to see in terms of the overall situation for civil society to have this kind of robust public debate, really engaging with the IMF and with the government?
Raj, I honestly hope we don't have to engage for a very long time with the IMF. I honestly hope that, because whenever the IMF is in a country, we are in ICU. And all they do is stabilize us to go back to high dependency unit or a general ward. We do not want to be patients. So we really hope we don't have to interact with the IMF. But in the meantime, we'll be proposing reforms to how the Article 4 consultations are done. And currently, we've engaged with a team that is working on the governance diagnostic. The report is not yet out, but we feel listened to. We do feel listened to. In the Article 4 consultation, to be honest, we stopped going because there is no feedback that you actually get on what is happening. And we are diligent. We would do, these were the targets. We would file a report. But we don't get anything in return. For Kenya, by the time the IMF came for their 4th review, we told them, stop the program. It is not working. They only ended, the Kenyan program was ended abruptly during the 11th review. But we had called it at the 4th review. But the reforms are at national level. Our parliament has brilliant people like Honorable Kenya, but that is the institution that must work. Because you've heard that we currently are at debt to GDP 67%. It is supposed to go progressively. The law wasn't progressively. It was that our debt to GDP is 55%. Then Parliament enacted that we need time to comply. Initially, they proposed 7 years, just kicking the can down the road. And in practice, they are doing that because they have renegotiated most of our Euro bonds and our China bond, so that the repayments will start 2029 all the way to 2032. The next government will have been elected. We have no law on public participation. Every year, we are in court around public participation processes with Parliament. At least 6 pieces of litigation are filed every year. But Parliament has refused to pass a public participation law. For both privatization and public-private partnership, we must stop favoring privately initiated proposals that are single-sourced and just allow transparency to run. Our debt mix must change because partly the second reason why IMF, World Bank, I don't know, when they do the restructuring, most of our debt is domestic debt currently. That means we are not, it's not about the dollar or anything, and there are better economists, I'm a lawyer, in the room. But because of the high cost of borrowing, business are not growing. Yeah. Because we cannot borrow from the commercial bank. Everybody borrows everybody lends to government rather. So there is no development.
It's crowding out the private sector.
Yes. If we are in recession, you have no business taxing us. You know, it's like bleeding an anemic cow. If you bleed an anemic cow, it will surely just die. That is what is happening in Kenya. But all this because we have the wrong leadership. This will have to be linked to the character of people we elect as leaders of different political parties, and that we must support our economy to become a productive production economy.
Let me just say, you want to say some last word?
You know, the statements are hard-hitting. Makes us feel like Kenya is burning. I mean, it is good that they're giving that kind of pressure to the National Assembly and the country. But I must say that IMF is a partner that we must have. Borrowing is not bad in its entirety. In actual fact, they say working with borrowed capital is better than working with your own money. And therefore, what we need to do is just to make sure that we move from that red line of 67%, get to where we have our low, that is 55%, and maybe plus or minus 5. But we cannot do without IMF, because I can tell you for sure, the reforms brought about by IMF have reduced issues to do with corruption significantly, have reduced issues to do with, or have increased issues to do with transparency in reporting, financial reporting. There's a lot of financial hygiene. Today, as we're speaking, we have passed about three legislations pushed by IMF. One is on anti-money laundering. Then we have the other, and Proceeds of Crime Act. We also have this act on conflict of interest, whereby government officials were trading with the government. And we're also pushing for legislation whereby we're going to look into our PFM, that is Public Finance Management Act, to make sure that there's a lot of prudence in the usage of public finance. And finally, we're also legislating on Public Procurement and Disposal Act, so that then we move from manual procurement to automated procurement through electronic procurement and digital procurement. And that is where we are moving to. We may not be perfect, but we are moving. And indeed, as she has said, the pressure on our economy is not really a bad one, as I would say. It is causing us to move to a safe place whereby now private sector can enjoy local borrowing, as opposed to what she has just stated. The appetite for loans is going down, even for the government. We are trying to reduce the fiscal deficit just to make sure that our budget is self-financed through our revenue.
Let me just make two observations as we close here. One is that this kind of debate is not happening inside the World Bank or IMF annual meetings. And so I'm very glad to our partners, Transparency International U.S. and Open Society Foundations, for helping us bring it to this stage and to all of you. And this kind of debate is happening in many more countries around the world. We're highlighting Kenya, but it's happening all over the world. The story of debt is the story of the developing world right now. It's even the story of Europe and the US and much of the developed world. And I think our panelists, the prior panel and this one, have really helped shed light on a way forward on these issues that is much more inclusive of a truly open public dialogue that we all can benefit from. So please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Sorry, Raj, just allow me
Yeah.
to petition this member of parliament from DC with the people's audit.
Let's get a picture of this.
This is the people's audit. He has promised that it will be debated in parliament for action.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the reception.